Quran, you know, some people they used to write some part of what the Rasul said, you know, the Quran, and they used to take it.
Have you got the originals that people wrote down on rocks and parchment? Have you got those? Where are they? I don't know. So you haven't got the originals, have you?
What's the original?
Well, when the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, so he then got some of his followers to remember it, didn't he? What are they called? The companions. Sahaba. Okay, so they memorized it, and then at some point it was written down.
No, not some point.
When was it written down?
As the Quran was revealed, the Prophet would dictate it to his companions, and those who were able to write, they would write it down. At one point, he had professional scribes. There are more than 50 scribes that we know by names, them. So he had professional scribes who write it down. So the Quran was continuously being written down in his presence. So they would recite it back to him to make sure that they've written it correctly. Because Arabic language, the script wasn't developed at that point, devoid of diacritical marks and vowelings and so on. But they were still, because it's their language, they were able to recite it back. So even though the Quran is transmitted in both graphic form, writing, as well as memory, the memorization has always been the most important form of transmission. So even if you now were to destroy, for example, every single written material of the Quran, from digital media, from printed books, you can bring back the Quran from a 6-year-old from, say, Indonesia or Bangladesh or India or England, because they've memorized it by the letter. That's how the Quran has been memorized today, the day before, the month before, the year before, and the tradition goes all the way back to the time of the Prophet and his companions. So the Quran, when the Prophet passed away, of course, the Quran was spread all in different people's hands in terms of personal, compilation that they had, their codex, if you want to call it. Some people had all of it, some people parts of it, some people wrote it in the shoulder of a camel bone, some people wrote it in different parchments, in the leaves of date palm stalks, in stones as well.
So where are they?
So some of them,
where are they now?
I'm just explaining. Some of these, what it may be later, but in front, to say what's the original ones is difficult to assess, because to say these are the original ones, you need to understand a bit more about the calligraphy and so on and so forth. But if you understand the process of compilation and transmission, we know that the primary materials, which is the most important part in any textual criticism, that when Khalif Uthman, or even before Abu Bakr, when they started that project of compiling and collecting the Quran, he said everyone...
Who started that?
One of the Khalifs, right? So when he said, now, anyone who had written the Quran in the direct presence of the Prophet, and bring 2 witnesses also. So they started coming, and Zayd bin Thabit, radiallahu anhu, in the Masjid of Nabawi in Medina, in the Prophet's mosque, he was compiling and collating all this primary written material. Because we are talking about the first-hand autograph. This is the most primary material that you can get off, because you're talking about the writing material that was being written in the presence of the Prophet and approved. So they brought verse by verse until every single verses have been collated, until Zayd bin Thabit was waiting for 2 verses, that he's not got this primary material. He's waiting and waiting. Now one might ask, how does he know the 2 verses are still awaited? Because he memorized the whole Quran and he had his own codex, but he didn't want to make it into an enterprise in which people will in later times people will say, but that's from one man. He may have made many mistakes. So the whole community, all the companions with their primary materials brought together, until Khuzaymah bin Thabit al-Ansari, he brought the last 2 verses of Surah At-Tawbah and said, this is now the complete Quran. So that's the all primary material compiled, collected by the whole consensus of the community of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. So we have utmost confidence now. The Quran that we have is not a one-man endeavor, his personal notebook or codex or anything, but the Quran that was agreed upon by the companions themselves, that this is what the Prophet left behind.
But you don't have the original.
I'm just telling telling you what from this compilation.
You don't have the originals, as they wrote them. You don't have
In the hearts, the originals in the hearts.
But you don't have the physical.
Is it necessary? How is it? How is it? I'll tell you why it's not necessary.
How would you know? How would you know?
There's the Birmingham.
Brother, but it's nothing to do with Birmingham. It is not necessary because the whole community gathered together the primary materials and then made into a compilation.
Yeah.
That compilation became the official standards in which copies were sent to all the other provinces. So in any textual criticism, I'm sure you're familiar with it, this is still a primary material because that's the consensus and collective approval of the initial recipients who witnessed revelation. Because we have a side-by-side running memorization program or transmission that safeguards and quality controls anything side-by-side. So you have dual. In fact, this is why people, even the Orientalists today who are studying in different places in the world, they do not doubt in terms of the preservation of the Quran from this Uthmanic standardization. But what beforehand in which when the companions lived and so on and so forth, that's a different matter. Because what we all have is that standard that the community approved and disseminated.
Okay, what was your name?
Mansur.
Mansur, nice to meet you.
What's your name?
David.
David, nice to meet you.
Take care.
Any other questions you have?
I'll be back.
All right. Take care.
Yes, but I was